morning, everybody. Like Michelle mentioned, this session is being recorded. All right, so we only have a few minutes this morning. I want to talk to you about a new solution that we have recently launched, and we're going to talk a little bit about some of the problems that we see and the way that we go about solving those problems. So let's spend a few minutes and just set up the use cases, and then the majority of the time that we spend this morning will be on a little hands-on demo so you can see a few things in motion. Okay, whether you are new to IT or new to security, or you are an industry veteran, there is a stark reality that you will never get away from, and that we are using lots and lots of tools that manage all sorts of access. There's users and groups and computers, and we've got configuration and an access control list, and the reality that we stare at is that no matter where we turn, a lot of what we focus on is managing access. Does somebody have too much access? Does somebody have not enough access? Are we doing everything that we can to make it difficult for those bad actors out there who would like to see our data get out? So the reality of the world we live in is this, and I just have a handful of screens here, screenshots. I'm sure you can immediately think of any number of other admin tools that you use that are specific to trying to get a handle around managing access. Active roles administration interface, we've got some of our entitlement profiles, we've got standard ADUC screens. Anyone who is working in Active Directory understands that all of the objects in Active Directory all have their own access control list. There are numerous access control entries in that ACL. So we have thousands and tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of research in Active. This isn't shocking to anybody. This is simply the reality of the world that we live in identity, is the access that we have to manage. So this morning, let's talk a little bit more about that and some new things. What if there was could gather all of these entitlements or all of this access centrally? And the key thing here is we could put a classification system in place. Classification will be key as we talk about. We all acknowledge that not all access is created equal. There's a lot of access out there that's just noise. It's just standard read-only, for example. Basic access that we probably have more important things to worry about. But on the flip side, we all understand that there is a level of access out there that is what we need to be focusing on. This is what the bad guys, the bad actors are typically after. They want to elevate their access so that they have the rights to do the things that they're trying to do. So what if we have a way all entitlements are centrally collected with a classification system in place, and that gives us an easy way to identify high risk. And a key thing here is we can identify that high risk regardless if it's ever utilized. There are also tools out there that can collect log files, that can watch for events such as login events or application logs, so they can see behavior and try to keep an eye on behavior and establish baselines for behavior. But there's an idea that there can be a proactive approach to this as well, and that is to analyze this access before anyone has a chance to use it, to focus in on where that high risk is and then be able to make some key decisions. So that's what we're going to talk about here for a couple minutes this morning, and I'm going to switch right out of the slide deck. I promise we wouldn't spend a lot of time in that today. Now let's talk about identity analytics and risk intelligence, and this is a SaaS solution, so I have my portal here running up in the cloud. We'll talk a little bit about the architecture, but we'll mostly focus on the functionality and some of the key things that we can do with it. So I have an organization or a tenant set up here, and I'm going to go into my identity analytics lab. And I'll talk just a moment about how I have this set up. Now, Oftentimes, I'll actually demo the initial setup because it only takes just a couple of minutes, but for time this morning, I've decided to skip the actual install so that we can look at the functionality. But I do want to show you, for those that are curious, and the reason that I call this out is simply the fact that it is a relatively, if you look at your spectrum of various tools and solutions in IT, this one definitely falls on the lightweight, easy side in terms of both setup and use. It takes relatively 4 to 5 minutes or so to get this up and running. So there is a small portion that would run probably on-prem or close to the application. So that is the piece that would gather the information that we care about. That's our agent or our collector agent. And this morning I have mine configured to pull information out of Active Role Server. Now, we can talk about some of the other targets that we have planned to support, but Active Role Server is one of the solutions here at One Identity that is specific to Active Directory management. There's a lot of things that Active Role Server can do for you, and we can provide you resources to follow up on that. But you know, in a nutshell, think about Active Role Server as a solution that can help you with a couple of key tasks around your Active Directory. Specifically, it helps with a lot of the automation tasks for onboarding and reprovisioning users, for example, Exchange mailboxes, shared folders, and even rights and memberships in Active Directory. And then the other thing Active Role Server does an excellent job is with your concept of delegation and least privilege. So instead of granting lots of native access within Active Directory, you can pull back the native access and in effect proxy all your access through Active Role Server. So this morning, we're pointing our Identity Analytics console here and our agent at our Active Role Server install so that we can pull the information out of that. So I just have that configured as such. Let me show you a little bit. I have a sandbox lab set up here. This is our Active Directory, and our Active Roles Server works is it has a series of access templates, and these are what you use to how you want to control access into Active Directory. And these probably aren't the best examples, but I have a whole number of access templates that I've played around with here. Permission access template. I have a use case that I wanted to grant some delegated access into my Active Directory. And to do that, I've created a template and I've assigned. And then what you do in Active Role Server is you then link that template to something. You can link it to a group or link it directly to an account. And then wherever it is linked, that group or account inherits the permissions that are in the access template. So I've created a template, assigned some permissions, I've linked it to a group in Active Directory, and then I've added a user as a member quickly, and then we'll move back into the Identity Analytics console. That particular Active Roles access template was linked to this group in my Active Directory called Custom OU Admin, and currently I have one member, Kelly. I've added Kelly as a member. So I wanted to set that up because what I did right before we started this live session is that I went in and kicked off a collection of all the entitlements and access in Active Role Server. So what we should see is some information we're going to drill into about this shown. So let's go back into Identity Analytics and let's go to our dashboard. All right, so with all that background in mind, let's start going through some of the things that we can bring to light now in the console. First, on our dashboard, we can put some numbers around some things that we probably assumed. Most administrators have a pretty good handle on the rough number of objects they have that they manage, and they also probably have a fairly intuitive feel for where the admin accounts are, but what this does is actually put some specific numbers to those assumptions. So in our Active Role Server, we have 3,191 accounts. And of those, we now know that 22, specifically 22 accounts in Active Roles have a higher level or are considered high risk. So that is a number that we can now watch and track, and we can understand when new high risk is associated, we can see that show up. And we can get a baseline now of our risk over time. In this case, I only am pointing it at one instance of active roles. We'll talk about the rules here in just a moment and the entitlements. And if I scroll down just a bit, we can see that since the last time we collected information, we have detected that there is one new high-risk account, and there is that Kelly account that we were just looking at in our active role server configuration. So what we're going to do is drill in a little bit more and continue to look at the information now that we can get out of this portal. Kelly Brown shows up here in our console, and let's take a look at what we can see about Kelly. So if we drill into the risk, we see a little bit of the information that comes out of Active Directory that we gather, the title, the manager, the department. And now that we have some additional widgets here that help us start to paint a picture or tell a story about this particular account. We can track the entitlements over time. This gives you a quick bird's eye view as to whether the risk on this account is going up or down over time. Is this account acquiring new access that we care about, or are we potentially moving some of that high-risk access away because it's no longer needed? So we can see that here. We'll talk about this widget here in a few minutes, but I want to focus on the bottom part where if we want to start to quantify the access or the high risk that this account has, we can now see that Kelly matches 3 rules. So because that we granted or we made Kelly a member of a group in Active Directory, Kelly can delete groups, delete organizational units, and delete users in Active Directory. And if we drill one step further, specific to this notion that Kelly can delete organizational units, if we needed to remediate that access or we weren't sure why that access was granted, we have one final detailed level view here that really breaks it down. And we can see that Kelly acquired this access because of the membership in this particular group. So that's the trustee, that's our Active Directory corporate, and the group that you saw Kelly in custom OU admin. And we're pulling this information out of Active Roles Server. Kelly has this access, or this account has all this access. The target here is Active Directory. So it would be anywhere in Active Directory. This isn't delegated to a specific OU or even a handful of specific organizational units. But this is all of Active Directory. And then finally, we can see that this access was acquired based on this permission, this custom/delegated OU, and that was actually the name of our access template in Active Directory. So we're seeing quite a bit of information here. This is all the information now that we've gathered for all accounts in all of Active Roles Server, and we're able to surface that here to begin to put some risk around it, to begin to track where we see the high risk so that we can tell when new high risk shows up, and start to quantify the level of risk that an account has, the type of access that it has. So let's step back a bit and talk a little bit about the rules, because one of the key components here is the fact that after we collect the information and we send it for processing, there has to be that classification, or how do we then determine what is high risk and what is not high risk? So one way that we can do that is the notion of rules. I have about a dozen or 14 rules here, and the name of the rules are fairly straightforward. We have rules like reset passwords, unlock users, modify groups. We have some down here like specific to Active Roles Server, those that are administrators in Active Roles, because that's also a key thing. If you think about the concept of being an administrator in your tool that manages Active Directory, that would be a very high-risk entitlement. Anyone that has the ability to administer Active Roles could then grant themselves or other people access to Active Directory. So that's a reason why we would want to keep an eye on that. But as I mentioned, now with Identity Analytics, we can actually put some numbers and specific lines around where our high-risk access is. And in our Active Directory here via Active Roles Server, we know that we have 12 accounts that have the ability to reset user passwords. So just understanding and knowing where all the access is assigned and where the high risk is specifically helps us begin again to really dial in on what that overall landscape looks like. Let's dig into the reset user passwords, what a rule looks like. We get some information about when it was created and modified. We can clone them. We're working on lots of functionality with rules so that they can be customized and tuned and even eventually shared out with a community that you can be able to see some insights as to how do other folks in the community view risk? What other rules are they using? How do my rules look to other folks' rules? What do they think about risk? You know, those types of community concepts. But a rule also, we can have the specific definition for the permissions, and it helps you understand exactly how the rule is matched. So that's why rules are important. They help us quantify risk, and they help us see where the risk is in terms of access or entitlements, where it's coming from. So in this sandbox environment, you know, we only have a couple of administrators here. We only have a couple of accounts that have the ability to create and delete users. If you were to run this against, now, you know, let's just think about your production Active Directory where you may have hundreds, thousands, or tens of thousands of accounts. I encourage you, and we've done the same thing internally. We run this and scan our own Active Directory, and it is very interesting some of the insights that you can start to pull out of there in just the initial scan. Whether you have tens of thousands of accounts or hundreds of thousands of accounts, you can start to see where all the access has been granted. So let's talk a little bit more about that access. I want to break down a couple different scenarios here just to, again, highlight some of the things that can be now seen once you have this in place. Let's look at account here, John. John, this account has high risk because they have the ability to reset user passwords in Active Directory. And the use case here that I wanted to pull out was Identity Analytics is actually able to look at the effective access on an account. What we're seeing when we drill into the details here is that John acquired some permissions from one active roles access template and some other permissions from a separate or different access role, access template and active role server. It is only through the combination of those two sets of properties that John was then able to match this rule and reset user passwords. So one of the unintended consequences that we can catch with identity analytics is this notion of effective rights. You may have granted a little bit here and a little bit there, but it's somewhat difficult to understand what is the cumulative effect of all of the access that an account can have. So I wanted to show this use case. We'll look at what the cumulative is effect when we put all those permissions together on a particular target, and if it's enough to match a rule, we'll highlight it. So again, between these two access templates, John now has the ability to reset passwords. Now, there's a decent chance this was on purpose, so that would be okay, but there's also a decent chance that this was an unintended consequence, and I was only trying to give out some access, and I inadvertently granted more than I was aware of. It's very actually difficult to pick that up when you're working just with one access template to kind of see the total breadth and depth of the access that's granted. So that's why this view from the account perspective helps shed light on that. Another example we'll talk about here is, let me look at another account that Identity Analytics has collected and processed and classified, and that's this account, Jason, which so happens to be my test account here. This particular widget here is interesting. When in the early phases of Identity Analytics, this particular use case wasn't on our radar, so this was actually feedback from some of our early participants. And that is the notion that access can be assigned or granted in a couple different ways. It can be directly assigned, in which case we would call it direct, or it can be inherited, or you can have, an account can have access because of a group membership. And it can be a direct group membership, or it could be via nested group membership. So it could be 3 or 4 or 5 groups deep. So what Identity Analytics can do is put some clarity on the access and where it came from. So if I look at an example here, like this account, it has the ability to enable or disable users in Active Directory. And I drill down further. What this is showing me here is that there are actually 2 different entitlements that are granting me the ability, or granting this account the ability to enable or disable users. One entitlement is via a group membership, so that's this one here. There's an access template that was assigned to the group in AD called Helpdesk Tier 2, and since this account is a member of that group, the account inherited those permissions. But I also see that for good or for bad, see at the moment we're not sure, but this is showing us that an access template called Users Full Control was also assigned directly to this object, to the corporate JSON.Fehrenbach account. So I wanted to highlight that because a lot of folks would say that best practices is to avoid assigning permissions directly to an object. Obviously, there are certain situations like anything in IT where it's not always possible to do best practice. But when you grant permissions directly to an object, it does potentially complicate some of the future scenarios where if that account changes roles or that account moves on, how do you know where all of the direct access is? And then how would you match or grant a different account that same level of access? So that's why best practice would be a lot of times is that you would grant the permissions on the group, and then it's easier to make a user a member of a group and remove their membership and add a different user if you need to swap that out. But what identity analytics can do is help you get some insight as to all the places in your Active Directory or active roles where you've directly assigned those permissions. So in our high-risk account view, we can filter. One of the filters now is by direct access. And if I just want to look in my Active Directory or my active roles and see all the places where I have directly assigned access, I can do that. And in my sandbox, I just have 2 accounts with direct access. This view is also interesting because now if you want to start to pinpoint like all of the accounts that have the ability to delete groups, you can filter on that and search, and this will again narrow that down. So it helps you again put some numbers and definition around access. So we spent a few minutes here talking about this notion of collecting information, of centrally processing it, of classifying it, and then bringing some awareness to where the high risk is. And then as the information is collected, whether it's an hour later or a day later, we can catch all of the changes that are happening in the directory or in active roles. And we can bring some attention to all the new accounts that we find that are high risk. Maybe before they had no high risk and now they have, and now they've moved into the high risk category. Or maybe they were high risk and they've acquired additional high risk access. We can pinpoint that as well. But one of the questions that typically comes up is, what do I do about this? Like, what actions can I take on this information? So I think that's important to note too. So I want to just share a couple quick things here as we begin to wrap up. First I'll point out that the information that we have here, we can pass that on. We can forward those events to, for example, a syslog server or your SIEM engine. So the concept of when we collect information and detect new high risk, there's all sorts of events that we can forward. So you can now feed that into your central logging server and put some logic around that. If you see new accounts acquire high risk and you want to have that set up to be alerted on or up and inspected, that capability is there. But then lastly here, there also is this notion of application. This was also a use case as we worked with our early test users and beta accounts. And what this comes down to, put a little bit of language around this, is this notion of a microcertification. And that might be a new term. Microcertification is a little bit different than what you may know of as your standard attestation or your access campaign. So let me do a quick compare and contrast. In a typical attestation campaign, usually what would happen is, let's say on a scheduled basis, maybe once a quarter, once a year, a manager would receive some information that would, have a list of all their direct reports, all the people that work for them, and then a list of all of the access that they have. And the goal is for that manager to review each person and then review all their access and then sign off on it. And that's pretty standard practice nowadays. What a microcertification is, it's a little bit different in 2 different ways. Number one, it's more dynamic or real time, so it doesn't have to be scheduled like only once a quarter or once a year. But a microcertification can happen as the changes are detected. And then number 2, the content is a little bit more contextual and a little bit more focused. So instead of getting that report with all the different employees or direct reports and all their access, what a microcertification is just the fact that, hey, there is this new account, we've just detected a change in the account, and this particular account has high risk. Specifically, it has the ability to delete users in Active Directory. Right, so a microcertification is more real-time and it's more contextual in that it just focuses on a portion of the overall access. So what that may look like if you choose to implement that, and this again all comes back to, identity analytics may help security find high risk and highlight it, but ultimately it may not be up to the security team to make the decision as to whether the risk is acceptable to the business. So here we have an example. John has this reset user password. And we've identified it. We know that it was a result of a couple of different access templates coming together to grant a combined set of access. So we can now look at this in the console, and I'm going to show you like what an ad hoc would look like. But if we're not sure if it's acceptable to the business for John to have this, what we can do then is fire off a microcertification. So I just sent that request off to someone, and all things being equal, we should see that here. Okay, so here is the person that I sent it to. They receive an email saying, hey, you've been asked to verify an instance of high-risk access. Please follow this link. Because we want this to be secure, they will have to authenticate. And this is just a brief example of what a microcertification can look like. So it's an entitlement verification request. It says John Randallson has some high-risk access, specifically the ability to reset user passwords. And then just a little bit of plain language here. Jason has detected that John has high risk, so please review this, and we want you to basically give us some feedback. Yes, I understand the risk with this level of access, and that's okay. That's fine that John can reset user passwords. Or frankly, either I don't understand what you're asking me to do, or I know for a fact that John should not have this. Something happened in the change control process, and this is not the intended outcome of what was expected. And then I could submit that request. We put this in here. This may or may not be useful depending on the audience of the verification, but you can then submit the request. And now we have some feedback in the console that this access has been denied and it needs remediation. And you can see just a little bit of the roadmap, but what we're now doing and working on is integrating this back into your internal change control or ticket systems. So this could, for example, feed into ServiceNow. So any denial or rejection of the high-risk access would immediately initiate a ticket so that there's a request that can be audited and tracked for remediation of the access. So there are a few examples of identity analytics and our ability to centrally gather and process all of the various types of access and then begin to cut through the noise to begin to focus on where the high risk is and in helping you make some informed decisions as to whether that high risk is acceptable. So I hope that is an informative 15 or 20 minutes this morning. As we begin to end here, what I would certainly encourage you to do is we have identity analytics available at cloud.oneidentity.com. And as you peruse through that site and potentially see some additional information, one thing to call out is that there is the opportunity to do a self-service trial. You can simply sign up, sign in, and do what I just demoed, all on your own self-service without, typically having to talk to anybody. So you can install the agent, point this at your active roles, start to get some information, and explore it for yourself. So let me check and just see very briefly if there was any questions while we've been talking in the chat. I'm going to multitask for just a moment. Okay, excellent. So it looks like we're good on the chat. So I want to thank everybody for their time this morning. We'll keep this right at our 30-minute timeline here. I appreciate the time. Thank you for spending a few moments with here as we talk about access and about identity analytics. And I encourage you, if interested, to view the cloud.oneidentity site and even check out a trial for yourself. Thank you, everybody.